Hi there! On this card chat, I want to talk about this book, Never Caught, The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. If you're interested in hearing about this story and my thoughts, stay tuned. So I'm talking about Never Caught, the Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. What a long title and pretty descriptive. First, I'll tell you the story because chances are you don't know the story of Ona Judge, and then I'll go into some of my thoughts on what it all meant to me. First up, the story of Ona Judge is pieced together by the author from the little we know of her life. Critics have said lots of the book is assumptions and generalizations drawn from a few facts to flesh out her story. Ona Judge did give interviews in her 50s, so there is some information straight from her. But it wasn't contemporaneous with the events in the book, and we all know how memory can distort with the passage of time. Ona was born into slavery in Mount Vernon, the Washington estate in Virginia. Her mother, Betty, was enslaved by the Washingtons, too. You see, the value of enslaved women was where they can produce more property by giving birth. Children of slaves are added to your property and added to your wealth. But Betty was the property of Martha Washington's first husband, and when Martha became a widow, she became Martha's property. There were about 150 enslaved people working at Mount Vernon by the time that Ona was born. Ona's dad was a white man, Andrew Judge, an indentured servant for the Washingtons. Andrew was a tailor, and he did the cool uniforms that George Washington wore when he led the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Andrew eventually worked his contract out and became a landowner in Virginia himself. We never know if there was ever even a relationship between Andrew and Betty, or if it was one of those forced relationships that enslaved women had to endure with white men. No matter how lonely a white man, they were always above an enslaved black woman. Ona moves with the Washingtons to New York when George Washington was elected the first president. New York was the capital of the USA at the time, but about a year later, the Washingtons moved to Philadelphia, which became the capital of the USA, while everyone was waiting for Washington, D.C. to be the purpose-built capital in an agreement between the states. Ona and her brother Austin were two of the 7 enslaved the Washingtons took with them. So at least Ona had somebody with her that was family, but on the other hand, she was being ripped from Mount Vernon and her mother in the only life she knew. Ona worked as a personal maid and seamstress to Martha Washington. Ona was happy enough being a favorite enslaved of Martha and treated a bit like a rich woman's pet. She lived in Philadelphia 6 years and had more freedom and access to more knowledge than she would have in the back of beyond, which would have been a Virginia estate like Mount Vernon at the time. It's in Philadelphia that she met the abolitionists and started thinking about getting her freedom. But even then, she had to be careful. She couldn't be seen hanging out with abolitionists, or the Washingtons would get word and ship her off permanently to Mount Vernon, cutting off any further thought of escape or freedom. At the age of 22, Ona learned she was being given to Martha Washington's granddaughter, Eliza, as a wedding gift. Ona was aghast because Eliza could be difficult and spoiled, and Ona wasn't enthusiastic about the proposed bridegroom, Thomas Law, either. Thomas Law was British, 20 years older than Eliza, and had lived in India with the British Empire, where he had kids from a relationship with an Indian woman. Thomas Law had showed up in the USA with riches from his Indian sojourn, along with a couple of his Anglo-Indian sons. As an enslaved woman, you had to worry about whether your owner thought your body was his in more ways than one. I'd say Ona was right to be worried because Thomas Law didn't care what people thought and also liked relationships with non-white women. "You in danger, girl? Run!" Ona ran away to Portsmouth, New Hampshire with the help of her abolitionist friends by stowing away on a ship and remained free despite the Washingtons' best efforts to get her back. She had a hard time escaping from the Washingtons because lots of people would recognize her. Her status as Martha's favorite pet meant lots of people who had come to visit the Washingtons when they were president and first lady knew what she looked like. Of course, these dignitaries brought their servants and slaves with them, so she would have been familiar to people in many levels of society. A couple of days after Ona escaped, ads went up in newspapers notifying people of her escape and the offer of a $10 reward to anyone, regardless of color, who returned her. Ona was recognized in New Hampshire by a U.S. senator who was friends with the Washingtons. He wasn't a slave owner, but felt he had to follow the law and report on Ona's presence to the Washingtons. George Washington was about to leave the presidency and didn't want to stir up any issues by retrieving what he considered his property from New Hampshire, which was a non-slaving owning state. So he used his connections to try and get her back on the down low. Ona by this time had married a free black man, Jack Staines, who was a sailor and who had kids with him. But Jack was away on a ship lots of the time, leaving her effectively as a single mother. When one of George Washington's agents showed up at her door and asked her to return to the Washington, she was like, no way. While plans were made to kidnap her, Ona ran away. She was no dummy. She knew that if she returned with her child, that child would become enslaved too. Ona Judge Staines always lived looking over her shoulder. She led a hard-scrabble life in New Hampshire, raising 3 children. Her son became a sailor like his dad. Her 2 daughters became indentured servants because Ona couldn't support all of them. But she said she would rather die than be a slave. When she was older, she did give a couple of interviews to abolitionist newspapers. By that time, she was free of the fear of being returned to slavery. Old people were not valued enslaved peoples, as they were just seen as a burden and non-productive. We learned that at Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, another video I will do one day, that it was better for slave owners to work them to death while they were still productive than to have to pay for the enslaved cares when they were aged. The first I heard of the story at the President's House in Liberty Park in Philadelphia. The President's House, the name George Washington himself gave to his house, is long gone, but a structure now shows the general outline of where Washington's President's House would have been. The President's House structure is effectively the waiting line entrance to see the Liberty Bell. The story of Washington's slaves are mentioned on plaques and artwork in the President's House structure. The open framework of the President's House, as it's reconstructed, doesn't give you a sense of its size. It was a 3-story building with an attic. You had family rooms, entertaining rooms, George Washington's home office, and the family bedrooms all packed into the main 3 floors. The attic space was where most of the slaves and servants slept. If you ever been to Philly in the summer, you would know how unpleasantly hot that attic would have been. Ona was lucky she wasn't stuck in the attic. Her status as personal maid meant she had a room next door to the Washingtons that she shared with one of their grandkids. So here are the things I learned from this book and points that struck me. The Washingtons clearly loved each other. Martha liked to fuss over George, and George liked being fussed over. It's a world away from the portraits and image you have of him as a strong leader of a young nation, a man's man. At home, he was a homebody. Once again, like in a book on Jefferson's daughters that I read and will review at some point, you see that the women of the day, even the well-born white ones, had very little say in their lives. Martha Washington had zero desire to leave Mount Vernon and move to New York or to Philadelphia, but she did it anyway. She didn't really have a choice. As a wife, she had to accompany her husband. George controlled the family agenda. Colorism comes up here. Ona got picked to be the personal maid because she was light-colored and looked good. She was also a great seamstress and was able to make Martha's outfits look good. Ona learned her seamstress skills from her enslaved mother, Betty, who was also a seamstress. That's how skills and education were passed down among the enslaved. The heartless cruelty of the Washingtons was also a big point. Martha didn't think it was a big deal to give Ona to her daughter after having been her little pet for years. I also learned that George Washington got his teeth from his slaves. I always thought he got his teeth from ivory or wood, but apparently good slave teeth was also used. The Washingtons knew about the Philadelphia issue about their enslaved getting their freedom if they lived in the city too long. Pennsylvania had a rule that the enslaved who lived in the state for more than 6 months would get their freedom. You can see the difference in rules here on slave ownership in the early United States. The Washingtons sent their enslaved home regularly to Mount Vernon just short of 6 months to avoid this rule. So Washington obeyed the rule of where he lived, but not its intent. In his heart, he was a Virginia slave owner. By the way, in 1796, in central Philly, there were less than 100 enslaved people. Most of the people in the city were free. Abigail Adams, the wife of the second president, John Adams, comes across as a northern killjoy. Dolly Madison comes across as pretty fake. Dolly Madison was raised a Quaker, but I thought the Quakers were against slavery, but clearly not Dolly. It was around this time that another Quaker, Benjamin Franklin, was talking about how terrible an institution slavery was. I was surprised by how the Washingtons were generally surprised that she wanted to leave. Why would Ona leave since she was treated so well? They don't seem to understand personal agency, which is so strange because since George Washington, of all people, would understand a struggle for freedom. The Washingtons had let Ona visit the theater and the circus, mingle with the most powerful people in the country, have a comfortable house, etc. What more did she want? They felt she was pretty ungrateful to pick a life on the lam and poverty over them. Post Ona's escape, George Washington in his letters came across as butthurt that Ona had escaped. She had slept in a room with his grandchild, been part of their family life, knew all their daily routines and habits. She was practically family. But family doesn't get owned. In fact, George Washington was so convinced that Ona would leave of her own accord that he convinced himself that Ona was led astray by a man. God forbid her little brave would have wanted freedom of its own volition. He thought of himself as benevolent and paternalistic, which is a deep Southern attitude towards the enslaved. Bless their hearts, those poor enslaved couldn't possibly be able to take care of themselves. I wonder if the push to find Ona and return her was because she legally belonged to Martha Washington and the Custis estate. Martha Washington was the one who really wants her back. George had to do what he could to keep the Custis estate in good shape legally for the benefit of her grandchildren. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt, I know. But when he died, George Washington freed the slaves he owned. He couldn't legally free any of Martha's enslaved, and when she died, she didn't either. Is it surprising that white women wanted slaves? Not really. They were property and money, and in that world, one of the few things that made a woman worthwhile was money. You had so little autonomy over your own life that being rich was one of the few things that made it slightly better. If you are interested in this aspect of white women and their attitude to the enslaved, read They Were Her Property, a book by Stephanie Jones Rogers. It was a hard decision for Ona to run away. It meant she'd never see her family again. Lots of her family did eventually become free in later years, and they lived fairly prosperously in Philadelphia. But Ona couldn't keep in touch with them because she was a runaway slave with a price on her head. I find it so sad that for enslaved peoples, family was the one thing they had for themselves. But even that was at the will of others who can just be ripped away at any time. Ona knew that freedom wasn't what it was cracked up to be. Yet she still wanted it. You may be free, but your options are limited with little education and no family to support you. Women at that time had few opportunities for work, and mostly washing and cleaning and domestic. And if you were Black, your opportunities were even more limited. Ona was lucky that she was a seamstress and had some skills. You were free, but you lived near poverty, which is what happened to Ona. As a historical novel, Never Caught is a thought-provoking book. I totally recommend it if you want to read about the Washingtons, the early years of the newly formed USA, antebellum slavery in the South, and women's history. Tell me what you think of Ona's story. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments after frankly rabbiting on all this time with my thoughts and comments. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.